Hey, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. And I'm sorry. Why am I sorry, you ask? Because I haven't posted a video in a month. Unfortunately, YouTube at the moment is not my primary source of income, and I actually don't make a lot of money doing any of this. And if you know me personally, you already know that my full-time job is an audiovisual technician. And some neighboring states where I live needed a lighting technician, so I've been traveling for the past few weeks, and I haven't done a good job about preparing my videos and creating consistent content and making sure that even when I travel, that I have content to post. Been busy. I'm trying to catch up. Thank you for your patience. But anyways, in this video, I have a good friend of mine, Alex Gamble, who is a professional Dolby Atmos mix engineer, a stereo mixing and mastering engineer. He's a wizard. He hasn't officially stated that he's a wizard, but you'll see why in this video on why I think he's a wizard. But the reason why I call him a wizard is because of his wealth of knowledge in the aspect of not only Dolby Atmos music mixing, but actually getting your studio right from the get-go before you get started with mixing. With that being said, Alex joined me in a Zoom interview to discuss some of the underrated methods of studio calibration that doesn't really get discussed all that often. A lot of people talk about EQing their room and getting acoustic treatment and figuring out the layout of your speakers. Those are all very important, and we talk about some of those in this video. But there's a select few that are really important that make the most difference in your studio that is never talked about. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get into the interview. There he is.
Hey, what's going on, man?
How's it going?
Going pretty good. I guess I'm gonna have to share the scene with my friend here.
I see that. Yeah, he looks great.
How's everything going, man? Did you manage to recover a little bit from a crappy sleep?
Yeah, I'd still never figured out what exactly happened. And for those that will be watching this after the recording and edited, I'm staying at a hotel currently for my work, and we had a little emergency evacuation. So, and that was 2 in the morning. So, but
Oh boy.
but
Oh boy.
it was a pretty easy day, so I wasn't too worried about it. Short and
Okay.
sweet.
All right. Sounds good, man. Well,
Well,
I was really
cool.
looking forward to this, dude. Thanks again for having me and wanting to do this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you on here and spread the wealth of knowledge between someone who's closer and more has been more into the immersive audio and calibration setup for how many years now?
Well, I first got into Dolby Atmos about 4 years ago. Pretty much whenever they went online with Apple Music, that's when I pulled the trigger on the setup. So I think that was 2021,
Cool,
or
cool.
yeah, I think so. um, and yeah, I had to learn this stuff because I had to calibrate it myself. I mean, I didn't have to. I could have flown somebody from Dolby in at the time to do it, but it just wasn't going to be practical for me. So they provided me all the tools and uh, like tips that I needed to be able to do it myself. Uh, they set me up with smart software, which I had to reach out to some live sound engineer friends to learn exactly what it does and how to use it and how to read the data and interpret the data. And yeah, made it happen from there. I mean, at this time, some of the tools that are available today, like the audience Orion and Sound ID and things like that, those didn't do immersive yet when I started. And so I really had to go in and figure it out myself from first principles how to make it happen, which I think in hindsight was a really useful experience for me. Because now even though I do use some forms of automated calibration, I understand what's going on and I'm able to check the work and I'm able to customize it with the knowledge of how you could do it manually.
Yeah, and I think that's very important that these programs and the automatic solutions, they're great as long as you know what first of all what you're doing, what the program's doing to your room, and second
Mm-hmm.
of all to make adjustments when they are needed, and third of all how your room is treated or what kind of speakers, how far, where exactly your speakers are placed are also extremely important because we don't want to rely on software alone to make the decisions that we need to make for ourselves in our own mix room. People jump in just with an automatic software and don't even consider other factors in the room that might be making a negative impact even with the automatic calibration.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Um, I guess the topic here is underrated parts of studio calibration, and I think what you're talking about is the biggest one is just basic setup, putting your speakers in the right place, listening to what the speakers do without anything on them, and trying to get the best result possible without resulting to tools. Understanding things like phase and timing and all that sort of stuff is really key. Understanding how reflections in your room might be impacting the sound. And I'm not talking about understanding on like a, PhD level. I'm just talking about being aware that when you put speakers in a room, the way they're going to perform is going to be different from whatever curve is published in your speaker's manual. And just being aware that moving it a little to the left, a little to the right, closer, further back, that's all going to impact the sound. And that's all a form of EQ in and of itself. You're going to get a better result if you can get things sounding good before you apply any EQ. And then the EQ just helps you take it the rest of the way, which isn't a sexy thing to talk about. And it's probably why it's not as discussed as things like how to EQ your speakers and products you can buy to EQ your speakers, because what we're talking about isn't a product you can purchase. It's just knowledge.
The skill
Um,
set.
and it's a skill set, and I think it's a really important skill set uh, to be able to really maximize your mix room and to be able to make the best decisions you can possibly make in your mix room.
Yeah, and along with this conversation, I think people get overwhelmed with all these tools. Let's say like even REW, although being a free tool, and like what you've worked with, Smart. Some people
Mm-hmm.
get these tools and may have to reach out to someone else for guidance. I mean, to me, that I feel like there's plenty of information. I know you've provided some tools, especially relating to phase, especially in the live sound domain. But first of all, spending that amount of money on a software you're only probably going to use once, especially if you're working in a studio. And now if you're moving studios, it might be worth having in the future anyways. But even REW, which I've talked about lots on this channel, has some great features and not so great features that might be worth looking into some other affordable alternatives. Not only having these alternatives is great, but realizing what you can do with such a minimal and affordable piece of software and hardware to make that adjustment in your room is just magical. And like you said, it's completely overlooked, and it's not a very glorified topic, but it's nonetheless very important.
Yeah, for sure. But definitely like really zeroing in on like everything you can do to your room before you apply any of those tools is just so key. The imaging gets cleaned up, everything just connects. It's huge when we're talking about studio calibration. So in a lot of ways, I mean, I was thinking about what the conversation would be here, and I think a lot of it is going to be just about studio setup in some ways.
Right.
Um, because it's all the stuff you do before you get to the point of the quote unquote calibration, which is so key and so underrated.
With that in mind, tell us a little bit about your studio, you're working
Sure.
with, and what kind of software we plan on using later on in this video. But like you said, the main thing is the setup. So if that's the case, what are we working with right now?
Yeah, so I'm at a studio now called Union Sound Company. I moved into this room in the facility in November, but my history with the studio actually goes back about 10 years or more now. Um, so I was actually the very first intern and assistant engineer at this studio, even when the studio was being built. I had the opportunity as my first gig out of audio school to be putting the walls up in this space. So I literally built this room 10 years ago. It's kind of a nice full circle moment that I'm able to be in the room now and working here as the resident mixer at the studio. But yeah, that's the studio I'm at. I've been in here since November. I set up with 9.1.4 array of Genelex for my immersive system. And then I also have two PMC 6.2s for stereo mixing and mastering, which I still do a lot of, but immersive has definitely become a really huge part of what I do. So I needed to make sure I had that ability when I moved in here. It's all being controlled via DADman, and my interface is a DAD AX Center. It's a little one unit, kind of like DAD's version of the Apollo, if you will. So it's
Right.
got all the flexibility and internal routing of all their stuff and just like a little bit different connectivity. It's got a 256 channel Thunderbolt card in it, which is what sold me. So the ability to just route things to different places on my computer and just really streamline the setup and customize the setup. Yeah, I was really able to do a lot of that on the Thunderbolt card. So that was kind of a huge thing there. And so the DAD, it's doing a lot. It's my interface. It's sending audio from Pro Tools to the Dolby Atmos renderer, which I still use the external Dolby Atmos renderer just because when I started, that's all there was. I got used to it, and there's a few advanced features in there I'm not willing to give up yet. Yeah, it's still a great workflow. And until I find a compelling reason not to do it, I'm going to continue doing it. It's my headphone amp, it's my microphone preamps. It is sending out digital audio to all the speakers. So kind of the running joke in this room is that there's a one analog audio cable in here, and it's this one plugged into the
Yeah.
microphone
Right.
because I'm sending out of my DAD via MADI, and then that's getting split into an AES signal that is going to all my speakers. So everything is ones and zeros literally until it touches the speakers. So when people ask me, what kind of converters are you using? Oh, you must be using those DAD converters. Well, no, I'm not. The
Right.
converters are in the speakers themselves.
Oh, okay.
Because
That makes sense.
yeah, exactly. Because every one of these speakers in here has its own DSP built into it for timing, phase, room calibration, and that sort of thing. If I went in analog, I would be converting analog to digital to get into the DSP chip, and then D to A again to get out. So I'd be converting out of my interface, then into the speaker, and then out of the speaker into the amp, right?
Right.
Um, so this makes it much cleaner. Nothing gets converted literally until it comes out of the driver. It's awesome. Super clean, super reliable, and extremely precise monitoring.
Right.
And the DAD, and on that topic, the DAD's also my monitor controller. I have to thank you for this one because I learned about how to set this up from watching one of your YouTube videos. I was helping a colleague of mine out set a studio up, and he bought a Matrix Studio as his interface. We watched your videos quite religiously to try to figure out how to do it, and so I got to thank you for putting that resource up there.
Yeah, it's no problem. It took me about a good, I would say 6 months to really understand the purpose of all the specific menus and assigning sources to the monitor profile and why that even
Yeah,
exists. And unfortunately, there's no content on it, so that was my baseline for starting the
very
YouTube
little.
channel.
I don't even
Yeah,
think Dadman has a manual.
they have the quick start guide for the interface, but it tells you really nothing. But
Yeah,
and nothing against Avid for that. It's for professionals and people spending 6 grand on an interface probably know better than I do, but that's besides the point.
yeah,
Um, I think it's worth noting, especially with your extensive setup, that what we're talking about in this video doesn't just apply to a complicated setup. You could absolutely go the way in using something affordable like the Audient Oriya and doing breakout cables to all your speakers.
yep,
And mind you, this isn't also just an Atmos thing. This is a stereo thing.
hundred
For
percent.
uh, this is for any kind of calibration setup involving studio and a subwoofer and whatnot.
Yeah, I feel very lucky that I was thrown into the fire the way I was when I had to set up my first Atmos system. Because one of the big things I learned there was how to actually cross over your speakers to your subwoofer correctly. And when I learned how to do that, it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. Like I did the same thing that every other mix engineer does when they're setting up a studio, and it's like, okay, I got some speakers, I got a subwoofer, let's plug them both in. Okay, I got a couple filter settings. I think this one sounds the best. All right, let's mix. But you might get it right if you do that. But
Hmm.
if you understand some of the principles of how to choose your crossover and how to time align and phase align your crossover, it really makes a huge difference. It goes from this feeling of here's the speakers and here's the sub to all of a sudden it feels like, okay, I just have one nice continuous full range system that you're just hearing and feeling. It makes a world of difference. Not to mention all the nulls that might be happening at the crossover point if you don't get the timing right. So yeah, it was really really huge to be able to learn that, and I didn't learn that until I set up Atmos in my room, and now even for my stereo mastering setup, I make sure I go through that process of time aligning the subwoofer and choosing an appropriate crossover point for the system and figuring it out from there.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And most people when they, especially when they get a sub, this is kind of how I was when I first started getting into Atmos was even whenever you have an integrated subwoofer, whether it be in a stereo or Atmos system, the goal isn't to make the subwoofer sound like a subwoofer. It's supposed to be an integrated part of your speakers, and what I'm running is a three-way Cali audio speaker
Mm-hmm.
system all the way around. So I have a tweeter, a mid-woofer driver, and a woofer all in one speaker. Not to say that the subwoofer can't make that theoretical four-way system. That's the end goal, is to make it sound like a cohesive speaker system, not your main speakers and a subwoofer just because you can hear the low end of the room. Dialing that in, I think, is super important. And when we really listen back to like our references of our favorite music, it's so easy to hear the details that either you would change as a mix engineer or you
Mm-hmm.
would never would have heard otherwise. So yeah, this is all great information, and I'm super hyped to talk about this. It's all also good. One of the first things involving in addition to our setup. So do you have any opinions on the Dolby spec in terms of room calibration?
I do. Yeah, I think in terms of the angles and the geometry that you choose to set your speakers up at, get it as close to their spec as you possibly can. They offer a couple different like template setups. One of them is called orthogonal, which is basically like you've got a rectangular room and you have the speakers, I guess, in the extreme corners and extreme sides of the room. So the speakers are like kind of pinned to a wall. It's more common for like theatrical setups. So if you ever go to a cinematic like sound stage, it's set up like a theater and there's speakers on the walls. And then the other one, which is more common and better for music studios, in my opinion, is the equidistant setup, where you have the listening position and you place each speaker at an equal distance from the listening position. So it kind of makes a circle on the ground level and then like a square over your head up top. And they've got guidelines and specifications for what angle everything should be at for different speaker layouts. So 714 has its own set of angles, 914, 916, etc. Uh, I think get it as close as possible to the geometry. I the first room I worked in, we were pretty close to an equidistant setup, but our front speakers were a lot closer to the listening position than our rear speakers. And that was due to uh, some things in the room that we needed to work around. Like we just didn't have space in the room to place the rear speakers like according to spec. Dolby will let you place them further away as long as you get your angles and your geometry right. And I ran it by my representative at Dolby when I was doing it, and he said it was fine. And the studio got listed, and great. And I turned out a lot of mixes there that I'm extremely proud of, and I think it's a great sounding room. Uh, in this room, I had fewer things interfering with where I could put speakers, and so I was able to actually do a more equidistant, like truly equidistant setup, And I find overall I'm getting much better imaging and I'm getting much better translation to headphones, especially in the equidistant setup. Because whenever I would throw things in the rear at the other room where the rears were really, really far away, they would feel really, really distant. And I'd be able to fudge that in headphones by, for example, taking objects that were panned to the rear and putting that on that far binaural setting. It would sound a bit more like what I was hearing in the room.
Oh, really?
Um,
Mm.
oh, for sure. Yeah, I was finding a lot of my binaural settings were being informed by the room I was mixing in. But that's a problem when we're talking about AirPods, though, because of course with AirPods you don't have the benefit of toggling binaural settings to customize your mix. You just get what Apple gives you.
Yeah.
Um, and so, especially for the AirPod mix, I'm finding being on an equidistant setup is is much truer to what I experienced in AirPods. So definitely for geometry, going to Dolby Spec, I think is really critical. The other part of the Dolby Spec is what we call the Dolby curve, which has been discussed a little bit, which is a target curve that they give you for when you're measuring out the frequency response of your system. And it basically is a curve that overlays in smart software. So I have a version of it that I can load into smart and it shows what the curve looks like. And essentially, you're just trying to get the frequency response of every channel of your system to lock right into that curve. It's a slightly brighter, slightly modified version of what we call the X curve, which is a standard in cinema. There's been a lot of talk amongst engineers about the Dolby curve. Some people are really into it and they just want to go exactly to spec, but it's a not much, it's a darker curve than what most music engineers are used to hearing. And I made the choice some time ago that I would abandon that and simply tune it to my ears. So I don't necessarily tune it flat. I get it kind of close to flat, and then I do like a little bit of manual adjustment using the Dadman software to try and tune the room a little bit to what I like to hear. Because I've gotten used to mixing on systems that sound a certain way over the course of my career. I don't really want to change that at this point. Maybe it's just because I'm getting old. but but at the end of the day, what really matters is putting yourself in an environment that is going to make your music translate. So I chose against the curve. I know a lot of engineers that use it. I know a lot of engineers that don't use it, and all of them are engineers that I think do great work and that I admire very much. And so that one in particular, there's a bit of dealer's choice, I think, on that one. I'm probably not being a very good company man by saying that, but that's my opinion on it.
Well, and I was gonna say, how would that Dolby curve translate if you I guess people that have worked in cinema for many years are probably kind of used to that, kind of like the X curve. Um, and especially with getting into the newer music environment in Apple Spatial Audio. I mean, in
Mm.
my opinion, I feel like especially newcomers would would hear that, and now the conflict is your playback system, your monitoring, and your speakers sound different than what the Apple Spatial Audio is. So you got to consciously understand that difference if you're going to go that route. Now, if you're doing cinema, it might be worth having that curve, and maybe if you're mixing music that is designated for cinema, let's say a soundtrack, maybe it might be worth checking having that curve.
Yeah. Well, the difference with cinemas is that the playback systems, like the cinemas that people go to, like commercially, are also tuned to that curve.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, Whereas to my ears, AirPods, for example, aren't. I could be wrong on that,
No, I think
but
you're right. I think you're right.
it doesn't sound like that to me. It sounds even brighter than my slightly bright monitoring environment. So
Right.
so I can't imagine that it's an X curve thing. But if somebody has data to prove me wrong on that, I'm willing to hear it
Yeah.
because
If
of
you're
I've never taken the time to measure it out. So
Right. If you're a big nerd and you want to leave us a comment on some resources that prove us wrong, please do. Leave it in the comments.
Yeah, I do understand why they might do it. Certainly, when you've got sound hitting you from all directions, things tend to build up, and treble especially tends to build up. My guess is that they probably want to tame a little bit of that so that when things are kind of hitting you from all angles, it's not as overwhelming.
True.
But I've been used to the way I set my system up, and I'm getting results on it that I'm really happy with. And at the end of the day, that's what matters.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess on the topic of scalability, when we're talking about especially working in a smaller home studio, going to AirPods, going to the consumer, and even potentially up to theatrical. What's something that we would want to look out for uh, and not to worry about in a home studio compared to maybe a bigger studio, or is it about the same? Uh, what's
Hmm.
your opinions on that one?
Yeah, I've had the benefit of being in a bunch of different immersive rooms, and now mixing in a couple different rooms. And I think the biggest thing when it comes to translation is getting that geometry right, and also just timbral consistency across your different speaker channels. So really taking the time to make sure that your EQ curve is dialed in and that you've got some software that can get that in check, and getting the levels right in all the speakers. So getting the SPL meter out and checking the levels after your EQ and after you set up your bass management, which is critical. Um, so and even if you choose an automated way of doing it, like really check it after and make some manual trims. Um, so yeah, in terms of getting things to scale and getting things to translate, that's a pretty key one. Another thing I want to bring up too is the center channel. It kind of gets overlooked a lot in music,
Right.
and
I agree.
a lot of people don't use the center channel very much for music, but some people do. Um, and it can sound pretty incredible when done right with the right type of music and the right genre and the right mixer. And I think you're doing yourself a disservice by putting the center channel at a weird angle or a weird place or putting a bunch of crap in front of it. When you're setting up your room, thinking about, okay, how am I going to make this room ergonomically functional, but also have a center channel that can be positioned appropriately and sound right. It's a bigger challenge than you might think because we're so used to having stereo mixing for so many years. So it's two speakers and a screen in the middle. So it's really the challenge is where do you put that screen? Do you put it off to the side, and are you okay with working off to the side? Do you put it kind of in between the center and the left and right channel? Do you put it above? So balancing those ergonomics with how you get a full range, great sounding center channel is a key one. Um,
Yeah, and one of my favorite mix engineers for Atmos, Bob Clearmountain, he mixed Huey Lewis a bunch of his albums in Atmos, and he really digs down on using vocals and the kick drum and the anything
oh
that's like
yeah.
a good mono transient source in the center channel, and really takes advantage of the immersive space to make it sound like it's coming from the center of the mix, and he does a great job with it, and I 100% agree. And I think another aspect I wanted to touch on is like having a bigger or smaller studio, like with sweet spots.
Hmm.
Like what's a priority in that? Is that something you should worry about? Like whether or not you have your speakers closer to the wall, kind of like how you have it. But if you have the
Hmm.
space, would it be more beneficial to bring them in? Or is that just something you got to measure out to see what's best for you
Hmm.
and maybe get a priority list? And maybe it might not be a bad idea to create an alternative listening position for calibration. Like obviously
Sure.
we would mix our mix position, but if we're in a small Atmos space or a small stereo space, would it be if we have the capability in our software and our hardware to create an alternative sweet spot. Is that something worth considering, or is that kind of overdoing it a little tedious? I guess it depends, but
No, I don't think it's out of the question at all. So with my Genelecs, I use the GLM system to calibrate and align them, and you can save different calibrations in the GLM software. And so what I've done before, if I know clients are coming in, is I might set a sweet spot that's slightly back. Because one thing I've noticed is that when I'm mixing, I'm kind of hunched over the faders, and
yeah,
and
right.
I'm making decisions more up here, and so when I'm mixing, I want to be able to have the best balance at my mixing position, which is a little more forward. But I found the tendency is that when clients come in and they sit in the chair to listen to the mix,
They're like
they
leaning
sit
back.
back, they relax, they're chilling out, and as they should. But that means that the sweet spot is a little further back. And certainly in smaller rooms, that effect is expanded because you just have a smaller footprint to work with, and therefore, if you move your head a little bit forward or a little bit backwards, the sound of the mix can change quite dramatically. I think having an equidistant setup helps with that effect because in situations where, say, for example, I'm bringing up the example where the rear speakers are much further back. One thing I found in setups like those is that those speakers, they have to work really hard and put out a lot of volume to sound the same volume at the sweet spot as speakers that are close to you. And so what ends up happening with that is the effect of moving your head back is almost amplified because as you move backwards in the room, you're moving back towards a speaker that is absolutely cranked up. So
Right.
getting your speakers to be equidistant, I think, helps with that. Another thing that helps is the positioning of the side speakers, and we've talked about this a little bit
Hmm.
privately, but in the Dolby Spec, they kind of give you like an ideal angle of where to place every speaker, but there's also this like range where you could sort of fudge it a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. And one area that seems to be, I don't know, necessarily controversial, but maybe a little bit contentious amongst people who set up Atmos rooms is where to put the side speakers. And I see a lot of people really like to put those side speakers right at 90 degrees, like right in line with where your listening position is. But the spec actually says the ideal angle is a little bit behind where your listening position is. I've
Right.
done both. I've done both, and I prefer it to be a little bit behind me now for two reasons. One is that effect we talked about earlier. When you lean your head back, you've got a little bit more headroom to lean your head back before you sort of eclipse the position of the side speakers. Because if you get those side speakers in front of you, your imaging really gets thrown way off, and it's not the way you're meant to listen at all.
Yeah,
Um,
100%.
so even if you're like leaning way back, worst case scenario is you're 90 degrees with the speakers, which still sounds good.
Oh yeah, for sure. I actually preferred the 90 degrees in my original studio, but that exact
Mm,
phenomenon is it's dependent on the mix, and every mix engineer is going to have their own way of doing things. I know plenty of mix engineers that still do a lot of front heavy mixes where it's mainly just the front two speakers with some added ambience, not adding to the deviation from the stereo and the immersive mix, but sometimes that's all a song needs, and I totally respect that. But there's a lot of mixes that I thoroughly enjoyed actually just scooting back closer to the rears just to kind of hear what the heck's going on, like background vocals
hmm
and stuff.
Yep,
But once you kind of lose that a little bit in the 90 degree, you just like you said, you move your head back a little bit and it just throws off that imaging. At least when you lean back, it's back to 90 degrees, which is still, like you said, super pleasant. And
exactly.
which kind of brings up to a perfect point to different levels of calibration and the leeway between that and the binaural translation, like, do you feel like it deviates too much, or is it actually more beneficial with that recommended, let's say, would like 110 degrees on the side surrounds, or even your rear
Yeah,
surrounds at a certain degree?
I forget what the exact angle is. I think it's maybe 105 or 110.
Hmm.
But yeah, I looked it up in the spec and I actually set it up in the room that way to be at the ideal angle. And again, I feel like I'm getting better consistency across across devices being exactly on spec. That's my feeling too, and it makes sense. You know, if Dolby's going to be putting their stamp on a new playback device, it's probably going to be a device that at least comes close to the spec that they require their mixers to be at. At least that's what we hope.
Yeah, right,
Um,
exactly.
you know, another thing too is I find with this angle, I'm making more sensible imaging decisions in my Atmos mixes. Some of those early Atmos mixes I did, like a couple of them I made really, really immersive, and I'm really happy with them. They're really cool mixes. But now when I bring those mixes in here, they feel kind of back heavy.
Right.
Like there's moments in it where it almost feels like the the weight of the mix is back here. And it's because I was using those side speakers heavily, and just like a slight change in the angle of where I place those side speakers, it affects like how I feel about the music I'm listening to in a pretty dramatic way. And so I feel pretty strongly about having them slightly back now.
Yeah, and especially with the if we're gonna consider playback in other studios, which I don't think many engineers are really, in my opinion. They might be like for their own studio, and maybe they take that mix to, like, let's say if you're working in a smaller mixing studio, you got a couple small iLoud MTMs, and you got a decent calibration, but or even just in headphones, and you want to take that ADM file or your project to a larger studio and really check it.
Mm,
Uh, that can cause some conflict, and I think it's wise to acknowledge that level of degree, and just even your side surround speakers could take a huge impact on how you intentfully mix a song. And one of your colleagues, Justin Gray, he mentioned this in a few Facebook comments about his debate on whether or not one is right, because he came from the surround world big time.
hmm hmm
And for the 90-degree translation, he prefers it with the binaural, from my understanding. But in the end, 110 degrees, when he mixes using that, it helps him to mix with the intent that a studio, if the song comes into a different studio that has the 90-degree setup, he would much rather have the imaging of his music come forward than to move back, which is
That's
which
how
is
I feel
mind
too.
blowing. And that's exactly pretty much what
Yeah,
you said, which is cool.
that goes back to the thing I was what I said. I've noticed that like when I was mixing at 90 degrees, things move backwards in the room here, which I didn't always love.
So I guess you touched on this already. One of the other important levels of calibration. First, we talked about the position of the
Mhm.
speakers of the room, and the angles, and what kind of leeway that Dolby might have. And I'm going to go into details in another video relating to the Dolby Atmos room design tool, which is a super great tool that helps you get your room set up, and with the depending on what speakers you have and the recommended SPL
Mhm.
calibrations, delay calibrations, a lot of stuff to play with in what is essentially is an Excel spreadsheet. And I'll be sure to leave some images up here whenever I go to edit this video in post. But the next level of importance is your SPL, and making sure you get that correct from the get-go,
Mhm.
because you don't want to in stereo you only have to worry about two speakers. Most of the time you leave them flat, or you adjust the parameters on both. And as long as that you have that equilateral triangle between the back of your head and the speakers, most of the time your imaging is going to be pretty great. If you're in too small of a room though, especially with an immersive studio, you're going, or even 5.1, I should say, you're going to have potential issues if you have to do orthogonal instead of equidistant.
Mhm.
And people always consider delay calibration, of course, because you got to have all your speakers coming at the same time. But if one's louder than the other, the translation's not gonna, it's going to be obvious when you go to headphones, of course. And I think that is very important. But what are maybe some tools that you would want to have to get a better idea of what these speakers are doing in your room, or maybe a better way to get those speakers in the correct positions without having to change your SPL too much, or gain
Yeah,
structure, I
for
say.
sure. For sure. Well, having a great SPL meter is key. Putting it at your listening position when you're measuring things out, and use pink noise. So you can either use like the Dolby Atmos render, or your DAW will have like a pink noise generator or something like that. And doing this, sending the pink noise out at a level that represents how loud you listen. Dolby usually recommends minus 79 uh, dB SPL as the level to calibrate at. What I actually calibrate at is the level I listen at most of the time, because that actually affects the measurement that you get here. Like if
Mhm.
you're really cranking the room and activating the room nodes and the speakers are working really hard, the relative level of each channel is going to be different at the listening position versus if you're listening really quietly, and therefore the imaging is going to change. Now, you can't you can't set a unique calibration for every single listening level. It's not really possible. But
No.
the best you can do is understand how loud you like to listen at and calibrate for that. So have your SPL meter in the sweet spot, send the pink noise out, get what the reading is. So let's say it is minus 79. Then go into the next channel, trimming it a little bit till it reads minus 79 there, and continue doing that. Also, do that process after you've EQ'd them and after you've set up your bass management. Because let's say, for example, let's say in the left channel, you've got like a big dip at 500 hertz. And in the rear channel, you've got a big bump at 500 hertz, right? So if you measure the SPL at the listening position before you address those problems, the top end of the speakers are going to be sort of misaligned, because that extra 500 hertz in one and that missing 500 hertz in the other is going to cause, that value minus 79 here to mean something completely different. So you want to flatten out the sound of your speakers as much as you possibly can before you take that measurement. So what I usually recommend to people: measure your SPL, get it rough first before you do any EQ, then do your bass management, then do your EQ, and then measure the SPL again. Because after you've done that process of bass management and EQ, the SPL is going to read differently. The Genelec software does a very, very good job of predicting what the final SPL is going to be at the listening position. And in fact, I took what the GLM system did wholesale at my listening position. I'm very happy with it. Um, other software for that doesn't do as great of a job. So it's worth going back and checking that afterwards and making some manual adjustments as you need to.
Right. And one thing that I recommend, especially as a home studio enthusiast for Dolby Atmos, is that if you for some reason can't get a hold of an SPL meter, uh, an iPhone and this app called Decibel X, as long as it's measuring C weighted, for that rough measurement,
That's right.
it
Yeah.
would be great to have. And of course, you're going to want to do your EQ adjustments. I wouldn't rely solely on that to use as an RTA as your EQ. But what I do like about the app is that you do get an average, so you can at least use that as a starting point. Get them maybe kind of trimmed, measure them out, do your EQ, and then go from there with maybe either a real SPO meter, or if you really just are having a hardship and really just need something quick, using a C-weighted iPhone SPL app is a great option. Now, I
Hmm.
would say make sure your microphone is also calibrated to that level. When you don't want to calibrate your speakers and then have your microphone turned down where you're not getting the correct level. So that's why I do think it is important to still own a real SPL meter, because then you have 3 points of validation and don't have to
Hmm.
rely solely on just your iPhone. But it is entirely possible. But if you want as accurate as possible, that's to me, that's the best way to go.
Hmm. For sure.
We talked about being cautious of room modes, and you can use a room mode calculator, uh, putting in your dimensions, and maybe where your speakers are placed in the room will be accentuating and creating dips. When you place those speakers, that will also help you determine whether it will be more beneficial for you to be equidistant or orthogonal or whatnot. So even that, and I think that's the point of why Dolby gives you two options here, is that depending on your room size and shape, it might be more beneficial to do it one way or the other.
Yeah, it's always a balance of the perfect setup uh, against A, what's practical, and B, what actually sounds the best in reality. A really good resource on that is actually the YouTube videos, which are their walkthrough videos on how to use the Genelec GLM software. And even if you don't own Genelec speakers or you don't run GLM software, the cool thing about those videos is that before they even tell you how to open up the software or plug in the microphone or do anything, they make you watch about an hour and a half worth of videos on acoustic physics.
Really?
It's outstanding, and they do it for a reason. Like if you look at how the GLM software works when you measure out your system and it applies the EQ, it actually when there's like a bump at a certain frequency, it'll use an EQ to bring that down. However, if there's a frequency missing, particularly in the low end, it doesn't try to do the inverse EQ to bring it back, because these people are smart that designed this system. They know that it's just smoke and mirrors. You're never getting that frequency back. If you see a dip, like a really big dip in your frequency response, it's gone. It's been canceled out. So all you're doing by applying EQ at that point is you're just making the speaker have to work harder for very little reward. And that's their choice of approach, and I think is the right approach. And for that reason, maybe to manage expectations or just to educate their client base, they try to make you understand how to properly place your speakers, what to look for, and what to listen for while you're doing it. And it really, really helped me a lot when I was setting up this room. And I recommend it to anybody, even people that don't own Genelex, to watch that and understand a little bit about what's going on. It's also useful to have a measurement microphone and some software that can give you live feedback while you're moving your speakers around to understand what's happening with the frequency response of your speakers as you move them around the room. Because every speaker, it's got a happy place. So if you find it, great. Then you have to do less EQ and everything's going to sound better.
Yeah, and is that a free resource from Genelec, or is
Yep,
that
you could. Yeah, you
we'll
can.
have to
I'll send you the links when we're done. They're great videos to watch. They help me a ton.
perfect. And speaking of the software and the measurement mic, and you mentioned something about placement and using a software to get active feedback on, leading to our third most important aspect of, and in my opinion, is the biggest importance. Something that it was hard for me to understand at first, even watching a lot of videos on YouTube, which is actually one of
Mm-hmm.
the main reasons I wanted to call you in, because you seem like you have a great knowledge and understanding of phase alignment with a subwoofer and your main speakers using filter EQ, or sorry, filters and EQ adjustments. you have your measurement mic there, so we're going to go into some demonstration if you're still down for
For
that.
sure.
Uh,
Yep.
Tell me more about what a phase trace is in terms of aligning your subs and your mains, or what exactly phase alignment stands for in studio calibration.
For sure. So when we're talking about phase, it often gets conflated with, the phase button on a plugin or the phase button on a console, which, when you
Hmm.
press it, kind of takes the phase and inverts it. Um, there's a lot more to phase than just that button. Um, phase refers to like it refers to like the point of the waveform that you're at when it's hitting you. So every waveform sort of goes up and then goes down and then back up. Well, at least the sine wave would. Let's use that as an example. And so the phase of that sine wave is sort of what position along that wave that you're at. So let's imagine a situation where there's a big, huge 808 coming out of your speakers at 60 hertz. And let's say your main speakers are contributing partially to reproducing that 60 hertz, and your subwoofers are contributing partially to reproducing that 60 hertz. So for that to be in phase, you want that 60 hertz to be sailing together at the same sort of phase, like in the same position at 60 hertz at the listening position. If your speakers are put at the 60 hertz and the wave is up at the listening position, and the subwoofer is putting at the 60 hertz and that wave is down at the listening position, those two are going to cancel out. And that's what we're talking about here. And it's not as simple as just like it's just up or just down. It could be like at varying degrees of that waveform at the listening position. And so for that reason, if you just put up a subwoofer and don't put any time into calibrating it, what could be happening is you're getting cancellation and you're actually hurting your chances of getting a mix that translates as opposed to helping it. Now, how do we measure that? So you need a few things. You need a measurement microphone. So I'm using the measurement microphone that you get when you purchase Sound ID software. It's a great measurement microphone. And when I was setting up this room, I did a lot of research into which measurement microphone to get. I was thinking like, oh, well, getting this amazing room and expensive speakers, I should get the best measurement microphone too. As it turns out, the Sound ID microphone is one of the only microphones that comes with a calibration profile for 0 degrees, 30 degrees, and 90 degrees out of the
Oh,
factory.
okay.
And that 90-degree calibration profile is really important when you're measuring an immersive system. And what I mean by the calibration profile is that depending on the angle that the sound is hitting the microphone at, it's going to have a different frequency response at the microphone.
Hmm.
So the calibration profile is something that you put into software to say, okay, the sound is coming from 90 degrees. Take that into account when you're making the measurements.
Yep.
So that's the first thing you need is the measurement microphone. You need a preamp. Use the cleanest preamp you possibly can. You can also get something called, I think it's called the U-mic, the one that you can use with the REW software, which is actually just a USB
USB. Yep.
input. And then you take the preamp completely out of the equation, which is actually kind of useful. But don't use like a gritty old tube preamp. Use something that's clean and linear, like right off the front of your like interface is fine.
Right.
Next thing you're going to need is a software to interpret the results. You're going to need something that can generate pink noise. And then finally, you're going to need software on the back end that can take the results that you're getting from your software and turn that into a calibration. So that software can be, if you're using a Matrix Studio or a DAD interface, is DADman, which is what I'm using. RME has the ability to put EQ and delays in, and that's specifically what you're looking for. You're looking for something on the back end of your monitoring chain where you can input your EQs, your delays, and your filters. There's like external boxes you can get for it. Like I used to use one in my old studio called a JBL Intonato,
Yeah,
also a
yeah.
great system. Um, there's the Audient Araya, which also does it. Uh, uh, the Universal Audio Apollos, the newer ones, they also have this built in as well. So a lot of interface makers are becoming wise to the idea that people setting up immersive systems are looking for these features when they're choosing an interface. And so for that reason, it's becoming more common that if you buy a newer interface, that those features are going to be available. But if you're specing out a new room, check for those features. You need the ability to put EQ in, have crossovers, and have delays at the speaker. You can use something like a Sound ID as a plugin in your monitoring chain. And I know a lot of people that are using the Sound ID plugin in conjunction with this software called Ginger Audio Sphere.
I've heard. Yep.
And yep, and it's a great system. I actually used it for a little while when I was kind of in between setups, and it works really well. Uh, the downside with that is when you're going through it, there's a bunch of latency.
hmm
So if you want it to be a tracking studio, also it's not super practical. It's only really good for mixing. But it's a totally viable solution, and if you're just going to be mixing, it might be something you want to consider. Um, so yeah, measurement microphone, preamp, measurement software, and then software for your monitoring chain to put the measurement data in. Now, the measurement software can be a couple different things. When I first got into this, I used Smart, SMAART. It's a really, really common software for use in the live music industry. A lot of the time, like if you go sneak behind the soundboard at a concert venue, you'll see like a little measurement microphone up like this, and then the smart software up giving you real time results of what the frequency response of the system is doing. People will use that to see sort of like what the system is doing, and they also use it to time align their arrays and time align those arrays with subwoofers. Um, but just recently, it was brought to my attention that there's a very basic and free software, which is called Open Sound Meter. And I started using it recently, and it actually has all the things that I used in Smart. The metering isn't quite as precise, but in terms of like doing this exercise of time aligning your subs to your mains, it has all the tools that you need. So I'm going to do this demonstration with Open Sound Meter and show you everything that's going on with it, how to set it up, measure your frequency response, how to get your phase trace, and then how to line up the phase at the subwoofer with the phase of the speakers. So I'm going to jump into a screen share here, and I guess I'll take over and show you how I do it. Okay, so here we're looking at uh, Open Sound Meter. So I've set up a measurement where on the top graph is a measure of phase, and on the bottom graph is a measure of frequency response. I'll get into what those are once we get a measurement up and how to interpret those. The other thing you need to do when you open this software is you click here on measurement and you get all these different options. The stuff on the left-hand side here is it's just some stuff about how the averaging works and what kind of curve that you're looking at. I left that all at default for this demonstration. This here is the weighting of the measurement. So I do C weighting. And then the most important thing that you need to do is here where it says M and here where it says R, if you hover your mouse over, this one says measurement channel number. This one says reference channel number. So the measurement channel is your microphone. It is the source that is measuring the frequency response at the listening position. So get a measurement microphone, plug it in, place it at the listening position, both in terms of position in the room and height. So, figure out where your ears are at when you sit up naturally and put the microphone there. Point it directly at the sky, which is what you want to do in a surround environment, and place it there. And what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, on my interface, which in my case is AX Center, that measurement channel is coming in on channel 202, but that's going to be a different number depending on your interface and how you set it up. So assign that to the measurement channel. That's your microphone. The reference channel, what you want that to be is you need to find a way to take pink noise, which you send out of your speaker, and reroute that back to an input on your interface that is clean. Because what the software is going to do is it's going to compare what you hear at the microphone versus what is being sent out through the speakers. So in that sense, you need a way of taking that pink noise, putting it back to an input on your interface so that the software can make that comparison of like, okay, here's the pink noise that's going out of the speakers. How does that compare with the pink noise that's being measured at the microphone? That process is what they call an impulse response. It's a comparison measurement. So if it's perfect, what you're going to see on this bottom one, which is the frequency response, is it's going to be completely flat. This top one is a phase trace. So how about we bring a measurement up and I'll show you how to interpret this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send pink noise out of the Dolby Atmos render, and we'll go back over to the software and take a little grab, and I'll show you how to interpret the results. Okay. So I just stored this measurement. So this green line here, this is the frequency response in my system. So as you can see, it's pretty flat throughout at about 750 hertz. There's a bit of a dip. When I was setting the speakers up, couldn't make the dip go away. It was what it was. So I'm living with it. And then it flattens out
Right.
again. And you know what? As you know, this is an amazing room. Every room has its things. And
Yeah.
you know, I'm going to put this demonstration together pretty quickly, but figuring out the right place for these speakers was actually a whole ton of experimentation, and this was the result that I ended up being the most happy with. So that's the
And
frequency response of the system.
worth noting that it might not be worth looking at this frequency graph and being upset that it isn't flat. So because if unless you're building your studio from the ground up and you have the dimensions, how tall it's going to be, and really having an acoustician is probably super handy in this scenario.
Huge, yeah.
Your room's not going to be perfect. So dwelling on the frequency response initially before any corrections or movements, and like you said, spending a lot of time moving your speakers and really getting to understand your room is super crucial.
Yeah, you know, with this in particular, one of the challenges with it is that my main stereo setup is PMC 6.2s, which are huge speakers. And so I didn't have a lot of room left once I put those up. And I kind of had to make a bit of a compromise of like which set of speakers gets the priority in terms of the best frequency response. And what I ended up doing is the PMCs are actually in a position that's almost perfect and almost flat. For example, if I do that same test and I go to the PMCs, so now you can see here the
Wow,
PMCs don't have that dip.
that's amazing.
So so it was a judgment call. I had to decide like, okay, what would I rather live with? And I decided like, you know, the Genelecs are amazing speakers, but I bought the PMCs because I just needed an absolute killing stereo set in here for some stereo mixing and mastering that I do. So I decided to maximize that investment and say, all right, I'm going to prioritize the frequency response of the PMCs in this room, and we'll make a little bit of a compromise on the Genelecs. And, you know, I inched them a little bit back and a little bit front, and got the best of both worlds. Again, quick demonstration to show the results. A lot of experimentation and a lot of fine tuning to get to that point. So yeah, so let's look at the results here. What are we looking at? So this bottom, I've been saying this is the frequency response. I've actually been incorrect in saying that. This is a measure of what the microphone is reading versus what is being put out from the speakers.
Hmm.
So so when it's flat, you're reading exactly what's being put out at the speakers. When it's not, that's the difference of the measurement. So that's how you're trying to interpret this.
Right.
This top one is a measurement of how in phase that measurement is with the input reference signal. So this is a pretty common looking phase trace uh, for a professional system. Usually things are pretty in phase, right down to about 500 hertz, and then they kind of start wrapping around a little bit in the low end. That's not necessarily wrong. You'll go into just about any professional room and see a phase trace that looks pretty close to this. There are tools that will get this phase trace to be almost exactly flat. The Trinov system is one of them. So the Trinov system will not just time align and EQ your speakers. It's actually going to apply an all-pass filter that completely locks in this phase trace.
Interesting.
Whether that's the right thing to do or not is a conversation for another day. But it's possible to do that with a very very like high powered system like the Trinov. So what we're seeing here is it's perfectly in phase, and then it's 30 degrees out there, 50 degrees out there. It doesn't mean that um, you're not going to hear those frequencies. All it means is that compared to the input signal, those frequencies are out of phase. So let's this phase trace is going to be the important part in determining how we set up our subwoofer. So let me kind of reset my Dadman software here. We're going to start from scratch with my calibration, and I'm going to show you how we get the subwoofer and the speaker to be totally in phase. Okay, so looking at the phase line now, we're going to show how you can use this data to line up your subwoofer. Okay, so first thing you're going to want to do is measure the frequency response of one of your channels, preferably the left or the right channel, with bass management off. So that's what's going on right now. So I'm going to shoot out some pink noise out of the left speaker, and we're going to see what the trace looks like. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this. There's that dip at around 700 hertz that we talked about. And then what we're particularly looking at is what happens when we get down to the low end. So I can see things are looking reasonably flat as we travel down, even into 45 hertz or so. It doesn't really taper off too much. I see a little bit of a bump here at about 100 hertz. I see a little bit of a dip here at around 115, but I wouldn't set a crossover point to my subwoofer that high anyway, so I'm not too worried about. Next thing we'll do is we'll do the same thing with the subwoofer. Okay, so let's take a peek at what's going on here. This one's coming in higher. The reason for that is I was sending it out of the LFE channel, which is already pre-calibrated to be 10 dBs higher. But let's just take a look at the frequency response and see what we can learn from this. So looking at the curve here, it doesn't become flat till about 120-ish hertz. There's a bit of a node at 100 hertz. That node I'm aware of. And I don't cross over that high, and it's never been a problem for me. But we need to be aware of it when we're choosing the crossover. I want to make sure I choose a crossover point on this subwoofer that doesn't bring this node into play. So I'm factoring that into my decision. And then when I get to about 95 hertz, it goes back to flat and stays flat down pretty low. So I'm pretty satisfied with that frequency response. But this note here at about 100 hertz, that's something I want to be aware of. I don't want to say, for example, crossover at 90 hertz or 95 hertz, because then you're starting to get into this cave a little bit. So that's one of the things I'm looking at when I'm trying to choose a crossover point, is what problems do I have in my subwoofer and what problems do I have in my speaker, and can I find a crossover point that basically works around those problems and doesn't bring them into play. So I can see my speakers are doing pretty well here, but my subwoofer has an issue. So I'm going to cross over before that issue becomes a factor in my playback system. So for the sake of argument, let's place that crossover at 80 hertz. So the way I do that is, in my case, in my DADBand software, I go into my monitor profile and I say on the left side, I want to set a high pass filter. I like the Butterworth filter, but different filters have different sounds. Play around with it and experiment. Again, this is a quick demo, but getting to this result was a lot of experimentation and a lot of trial and error. But I'm going to do a high pass at 80, which is going to take everything above 80 hertz and allow it to go through the speakers. Everything below gets cut at the speaker. And then conversely, everything below 80 hertz gets sent to the subwoofer. And I'm going to do this with a slope of 24 dBs per octave. I'm going to choose that because it's the highest that I'm able to do in DADMAN. And I want to really make sure that that issue that I saw at 100 hertz doesn't become a factor at all. So I really want to cut off pretty steeply so that doesn't play into my playback system at all. Okay, so now what we're going to do, I'm going to show you what happens here if, turn that off. Okay, so I'm going to show you now with no delay at the subwoofer and no delay at the speaker, what the phase trace looks like and what the result of that might be when we combine the subwoofer and the speaker. And we'll decide if it's fine or if it's a problem and how we're going to need to fix that problem. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the pink noise coming out of the speaker with bass management on and the subwoofer off. So everything below 80 hertz is going to get filtered out. So we are going to take the subwoofer and turn it off in DADBand. And let's measure. Okay. You'll notice that while I was doing that, at first the phase trace looked a little bit weird. And then I pressed this button that said apply estimated delay. And so every software that does this, whether it's smart or whether it's this one, is able to figure out what the delay is between that reference signal and the signal that's measured at the microphone. And it's able to read that in real time. And what I had to do was, I'd say, take that delay into account when you're measuring the phase, because the delay between the reference and the measurement is going to impact that phase reading. So I applied it, and then the phase reading looked a lot more normal. So we're going to save this phase trace here. And now I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to send to the bass managed subwoofer at 80 hertz. And we're going to compare the two. And then I'm going to combine them, and we're going to see what the issues are. So back to the original signal. Okay, so now we're just getting the subwoofer. Okay, so we can see here now the subwoofer is being crossed over a lot more steeply. You can see that thing at 100 hertz still there, but it's crossing over pretty steeply, so it's kind of taking it out of play. Um, and we can see here that not exactly at 80 hertz, it's more like 85 hertz. It's kind of handing off between the subwoofer and the speakers. Um, so theoretically, what we want to happen is the frequency response of the subwoofer plus the speaker to just be this nice continuous line when we put them together. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play back the subwoofer and the speaker together, both of these crossovers, and then we're going to take a look at the frequency response of that. Okay,
Wow. Good Lord.
good Lord is right. I you wouldn't want to be mixing any bass notes that are at 85 hertz on this because you're not going to hear them. Because take a
Yeah.
look at that. What we would want to see here is that this sub and the satellite speakers just kind of make a nice continuous line there. But take a look. We get a big gigantic dip at that frequency. And so what
That's
that's telling me
amazing.
here is that at this frequency, which was 85 hertz, which was that point I talked about earlier, where the sub and the speaker were interacting the most, that frequency is out of phase at that crossover point. Of course, once we're past the low pass, everything's fine. And once we're past the high pass, everything's fine. But at this point where the two are handing off, we've got a problem. And man, actually, I was going to say you'd be surprised. I'm not surprised anymore at how many studios I go to, and I just press play on something, and I can instantly hear that they did not do this measurement and did not do this work.
Just like the
Because you
kick
might think
drum's gone.
exactly, and a lot of people will just set up their subwoofer and their speaker by ear, listening to some music that they know. But if your music doesn't have a kick drum that's resonating at 85 hertz, you're not going to know that you have a problem
Hmm.
until one day you go to mix something that has a kick drum at 85 hertz and you're working crazy hard with compressors and EQ to try to get it there, and you're simply never going to hear it because the system's not capable of reproducing this. So we
Exactly.
have a problem. How do we fix the problem? Well, first of all, from our first two graphs that we did, we can actually see the source of that problem. So let's go here. Let's bring up the sub trace and let's bring up the speaker trace. And let's zoom in a little bit here. I'm going to change the scale a touch. And we're going to go from 20 hertz to, uh, let's say 300 hertz. That's going to zoom in on the phase trace here. And again, the interactions seem to happen at 85 hertz, so which is right around here. Okay, so you can see here the blue line, which represents the phase of the subwoofer, and the purple line, which represents the phase of the speaker, they're in two completely different places. So again, back to that analogy I said earlier, like the subwoofer might be sort of at this point of the waveform, and then the speaker might be at this point of the waveform. It's causing a cancellation there. And so what we need to do is we need to use whatever tools are at our disposal to get those two phase lines to lock in at that crossover point. So in my case, I'm going to use the Dadman software because in the Dadman software, you can set delays on the speakers. And again, back to what I was saying earlier about how timing will impact that phase trace, I'm going to use the delay to basically shift the phase trace over to be locked in with the subwoofer. So I'm using Dadman. There could be controls on your subwoofer to do this. Some
Well,
subwoofers have actually knobs for phase on them, and that's another tool you can use for that. The other
and
thing you could do is
oh, go
physically
ahead.
move the subwoofer.
Yeah, you knew exactly what I was gonna say.
Yeah, exactly. Because all we're talking about here is timing. I don't have the benefit of doing that because with the way my room is set up, the subwoofer kind of has to be where it is. There's no room to move it. But if you have the ability to move your subwoofer or move your speakers, do one or the other because it's going to impact the timing at the listening position. and it's going to move those two phase trace lines closer together. But in my case, I have to do it digitally because of some limitations in my room. So I'm going to measure again, and this time I'm just going to have the subwoofers trace up, and we're going to see a real-time trace of the speaker. And what we want to see happen is like to apply a little bit of delay, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit less until those two phase lines lock in. So I'm going to go to that part of the demo here now, and you'll see what happens. And the before and after is pretty dramatic. So again, we are going to mute the subwoofer. This is just going to be the speaker coming from my left channel, filtered at 80 hertz. All right. Okay, so it's still far off, so we're gonna add a little bit of delay. So I'm gonna be banking over to Dadman, adding a bit of delay, going back here and seeing the result. Again, it's this range here we're looking at. So you can see it inching closer. I just added 2 milliseconds of delay and it got much closer to the line here. Let's do the same thing. Let's maybe go to 3 milliseconds and see what the result is. Let's try 4. Okay, let's store that. So 85 hertz was that area where we're having the dip. So let's take a look. Where's our 85 hertz? That is right around here. Pretty close. Ideally, you want to be in a situation where these two slopes are identical. It's rarely the case in real life. So what you want to do is kind of get them as close as possible where that interaction is happening.
Yeah, that crossover
So
point's probably the part where you would want that 85 hertz to be. Like currently it's at what,
exactly.
like 70 something. Uh
Yeah. Well, the crossover in the Dadman filter was 80 hertz, but the problem it was causing was at 85 hertz.
mhm.
And I was finding where the handoff wanted to happen was actually closer to 85 hertz. So again, these are the graphs you want to trust and when you're making those determinations. So I'm going to try to optimize this for 85 hertz. So if I look again at my delayed speaker versus my subwoofer, I hover my mouse over 85 hertz. Where is that? Here, pretty close, but could be a little bit closer. Let's maybe add like another 0.5 of delay on that and see what happens. Yeah, even closer now. Okay, we're doing pretty good here. Let's now take a measurement of the full system, so subwoofer plus the speaker, and let's see what that looks like. And let's compare it to what the subwoofer plus speaker was doing with no delay. So we're going to turn the subwoofer back on. And we're going to run our pink noise again, and let's capture the trace.
Beautiful.
Beautiful indeed. Compared with this one, check it out. Our 85 hertz is back, and it's happy. It's nice and linear. It is locked in with the subwoofer. Everything at that zone is in phase and happy. So you're going to get really nice full range translation with this curve.
And you haven't sacrificed anything else in the frequency spectrum. Like that dip was what, 20 dB? Is that what I'm seeing? You s- at negative
Yeah, I mean,
70.
yeah, like everything else is kind of averaging just below 50, and this was basically down to minus 70. I mean, that might as well be minus infinity. Like that, it was totally
Yeah.
canceling out.
So you're when
So,
you do the
then we flatten it out.
yeah, and you're not when you do this phase alignment, it's almost always a benefit. You're not losing anything in the frequency spectrum in that area by doing this phase alignment.
No, you're only gaining translation by doing this. The places where you could get into trouble is if you add too much delay on a certain signal. So, for example, like at a certain point, that line is going to sort of that was moving to the right when I added delay is going to kind of move beyond it. But then if I sort of go again, maybe like another 4 milliseconds, it's going to lock back in again. But then that's going to mean that like kick drums that come out of the subwoofer are going to be like delayed behind kick drums that are at the speaker. So that's an area where you can get into trouble. You only want to apply as much as you need to actually get things in time at the listening position. No more, no
Right.
less. Because just in phase doesn't necessarily mean in time. So you got to be really careful with these tools. Only apply as much as you need to get it there.
Yeah, and in this scenario, you actually delayed your speakers first instead of your subwoofers. Would it be will there be a situation that you might need to do it the other way as well?
Absolutely. So if you when you're adding that delay, what you're going to see is those phase traces shift over to the left. So in my situation, if I saw that the subwoofer's phase trace line was just slightly to the left of the phase trace line of the speaker, then I would actually delay the subwoofer instead, so that I can sort of creep the subwoofer over to the left side a little bit. Um, so that's where you would make that determination. It's also just using like a little bit of common sense. Like in my room, when I look at how close my speakers are versus how close my subwoofer is, you'd know just looking at the setup that like, okay, yeah, I actually I need to delay my speakers.
That's incredible. And like you said, anybody can do this. And if you end up not using a software solution and you have the room in your room to sacrifice moving a subwoofer, play around with moving your sub. The majority
Exactly.
of what takes the most time and getting it right is just moving your speakers and your subs and using a graph with the equipment you have in like Open Sound Meter or Smart to determine what's actually best in your room. It's not good enough just hearing and using it as reference. You'll get the most improvement by seeing what the graph says and then making the adjustments manually if you feel it is needed. Like I know some people, I think another Atmos engineer that I know has a little bit of a bump in the low end, kind of like to similarly replicate that X curve, but they understand, they know that they're boosting that. So whenever they listen back on
Hmm.
their Atmos system, it still translates to binaural and other studios. That's just how they understand their room. So if that's what you need to do, do it.
Yeah, but a listening preference that is conscious is different from uh, like an incorrectly set up system, which is unconscious. So the key here is information. Information is power. So get
Yeah.
the information, empower yourself, and get your system as locked in phase wise as you possibly can, so that you're going to be making good decisions. Then, if you choose to change the timbre of your playback system, at least you're doing it knowing that everything is capable of being reproduced in that system.
100%.
Yeah, I'll note too other things that can impact the phase. Uh, Position, we mentioned. Timing, we mentioned. Some subwoofers on them have like a little knob where you can adjust the phase on them. So that's another tool that you can have at your disposal. What that's called is an all pass filter. So it lets all the audio through, but it just adjusts the phase of that audio coming out. So if you have that, that might be a better tool or a different tool to use, and you might want to experiment with one or the other. The other thing that can adjust it is the filter type and the filter slope. So let's even compare for just a second here. Like I've got the trace up of the subwoofer with the filter at, where was it? I think it's this one here. No, this one. Okay.
There it is.
So this was the trace of the subwoofer with the crossover at 80 hertz and a slope of 24. But let's see what happens if we just, for example, change the slope to 12. And you'll be surprised, man. There's can be a lot of change here when that sort of thing happens. Okay, so there's our 24 slope. I'm gonna pop over to Dadman here, and let's quickly change our low pass. Yeah, low pass is what we want. Let's change the filter slope to 12 and see what happens.
And right now you're using 24 dB still on your high pass, but in conjunction with your
But
high
at
pass
80,
at
yeah.
24, you're using your 12 dB octave at your low pass. So you're using two different filters right now.
Yeah, so that's going to be this situation, just as an illustration here,
Yeah.
just to show you the difference. So let's go to 12. There we go.
Wow.
Changed again.
Yeah.
So let's capture that and let's talk about that for a second. So you can see it changed again. So let's say you're in a situation where timing isn't quite getting you there, or you're having to apply so much timing that it's becoming impractical. Let's say you don't have the ability to adjust phase, but you still need them to lock in. This is another tool at your disposal to do that. Anything you change on a filter, whether it's frequency, slope, type, it's going to change this phase trace. So that's another tool in your toolkit. For example, on my PMCs, I believe I've got a 24 dB on one side and a 12 dB on the other side. And what it did was a combination of two things. Is it was the best choice to be able to lock the phase in, but also there was this problem on the PMCs that was in a weird place that interacted with that problem you saw on the subwoofer, which was in another weird place, and just kind of fudging the slopes a little bit made both of those problems go away and made things lock right in. So again, filters affect phase. Understanding this is going to feed back on your mixing too, because now you know that when you're applying that, high pass filter on your vocal, it's not just getting rid of frequencies, it's messing with the phase of those frequencies. When you're putting a high pass on the overhead microphones of your drum kit, and all of a sudden the kick drum close mic sounds weird, well, it could be because you've changed the phase relationship between your overheads and your kick drum mic. So it's all interrelated. And when you see it on the graph, it starts to make a lot more sense.
Right. Yeah, I mentioned this in one of the summary remarks is what, yeah, is it tedious? Is everything we're doing in this scenario, we're not even including the idea of, I mean, we are including the idea of actually physically moving the speakers before actually adding delay. First of all, that's already tedious enough, and then learning how to use all this software. But so is good mixing, mastering, and recording.
Exactly.
If you're not tedious about understanding and getting it right from the get-go, what are you doing?
Yeah, exactly. So again, I don't blame anybody because you don't know what you don't know. Again, this was a revelation for me 4 years ago when I set up Atmos for the first time. These concepts have fed back hugely on my mixing, both in terms of understanding my mixing tools better, but also in terms of being extremely confident now in my playback system. Because now I know that when I make a decision in the mix, that that's being reflected back to me. with the speakers, and there aren't these weird anomalies happening that are causing me to make decisions blindly.
Yeah, kind of like people using a compressor and using the automatic settings. What it's not a conscious decision. Like your intent behind why you make the decisions in your mix is also based off of the skill set you know about the tools that you're using, creating the mix,
Exactly.
and getting it before you even start mixing is just it's tremendous. It's tremendous
Now,
information.
now that said, that those automatic settings on compressors, they can sound great sometimes,
Hmm.
but but not understanding attack and release isn't a reason to use it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, 100%.
So yeah, that's that in a nutshell. Again, like I kind of knew where we were going with this, and I knew what delay settings were going to work because I've done this already with my room. But there was a lot of experimentation to get it here. One thing I'll add to this is so I did that with one channel. Um, in theory, if you've got all of your speakers uh, timed at the listening position, so you've applied appropriate delay so that everything hits the listening position from all speakers in time. Theoretically, that phase trace on your subwoofer, if you put the same filter on every speaker and you apply the same delay to every speaker relative to the subwoofer, of course, um, then those are all going to lock in phase together. Um, if you have different brands of speakers or different sizes of speakers, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. But for example, all my Genelec speakers are exactly the same size. And so I just had to do this with the left speaker. And then I went through and I checked it with all the other speakers, and it was all pretty locked in. There's slight variations in how the trace looks, but generally speaking, that was a nice alignment for every one of my channels. So for that reason, when you're doing this, first thing you're going to want to do is get all the speakers lined up at the listening position. So, using whatever software tools you have available for that. I use the GLM system for that, which did it very accurately. You can use Sound ID for that. There's a manual measurements you can make, and you can use things like Dart to get that. Um, you can use this software to do that even if you want. So even
Mhm.
I'll show you quickly how that works. So let's turn off my calibration on GLM here real quick.
And just so
Um,
you guys know on YouTube here that the GLM software he's using did not have any kind of EQ or anything. It was just time aligned from what I understand.
no, that's not true in this
Oh,
situation. It was EQ'd. It was EQ'd already with this. Um,
but oh, okay.
in terms of whether you should do that before or after, I think depends on the software you're using. For example, when I do SonarWorks calibrations, I do the subwoofer alignment first, and then I EQ the speakers because the measurements you get in SonarWorks are going to be reading that interaction between the subwoofer and the speakers. So if
Oh,
you measure in
okay.
SonarWorks, if you don't do that process first, SonarWorks is going to tell you you have a huge problem in your room at 85 hertz. But that's actually not true. You have a huge problem with your subwoofer alignment at 85 hertz.
Okay.
Because
That makes sense.
SonarWorks, what SonarWorks is doing is it's measuring channels. It's not measuring speakers. So channel one, or your left channel, is that speaker plus subwoofer. Your center channel is the center channel plus subwoofer, and it's going to measure that. So when you're doing SonarWorks or slash Sound ID, do this process first. With GLM, what it actually does is it measures the speakers. It's not measuring the interaction between those speakers yet.
Hmm.
If I had additional Genelec hardware, like for example, if I had the Genelec box that does crossovers, the GLM software is going to do this whole process automatically for me. It's going to measure that interaction. It's going to choose an appropriate crossover. It's going to time alignment. But I don't have that. But I have dad bandwidth, and I'm comfortable doing it manually. So actually, it really depends on your methods for this, whether you do this first or second.
Gotcha.
Um,
Okay.
in any case, I'm gonna turn my GLM off, and it's gonna take away all my time alignments, and I'll show you quickly how you would do manual time alignments. It's really not as hard as you think. So I've got the subwoofer turned off, first of all, so that we're not getting any interactions with the sub and the speaker. So first thing we're going to do is, let's even go to like 0 delay on the left speaker here. So let's measure. Well, actually, the first speaker you should measure when you're doing this is the speaker that's furthest away from you, because that speaker is going to get 0 delay. Because what's going to happen is that speaker is going to take the longest to get sound to you. And so that sound is going to hit you last. And because of that, the speakers that are closest to you need to delay in order for that sound to reach the listening position at the same time. So let's measure my left rear speaker, because I know that that's the furthest speaker away from me right now. Even though I said earlier I've got it pretty close to equidistant, it's actually slightly further. Let's
What
send
could you,
some pink noise.
sorry,
Sorry, go ahead.
before you go on to putting pink noise, what could you use to measure the distance between your mix position and the speaker? I think we mentioned that in our previous
Oh, for sure.
conversation.
Actually, yeah, under on the topic of underrated things, can you see my camera still when I'm on screen share?
Yeah, let me
Okay,
turn off your screen share for just a second.
okay. I'm gonna stop share.
Yeah,
So yeah,
there we go.
actually, in terms of tools to measure that, one thing, on the topic of underrated things for studio calibration, owning one of these. This is a little laser measurement device. And so what it is it takes, whatever's at the back end of this little device, shoots a laser at the front end, and then it gives you a real-time reading of the distance. So like, for example, I move my hand a little closer, the value goes up. When it's further away, it goes down when it's closer. So it's a real-time measurement. I mean, you could do this with a measuring tape, but it's just a pain in the butt when you've got 11 or more speakers.
Yeah,
So, I like when I was setting this room up, actually, I like really went and took the time to, I would use my measurement microphone, which I would, first of all, place perfectly, like symmetrically in my room to figure out where like the center of the room actually is and where I should sit. And, put my desk there and to make sure that I'm sitting right in the center of the room. And then from there, I would use this as like a measurement reference. I go to this speaker, find the distance, go to the opposing speaker, and make sure it's at the exact same distance. Doing that process, and I'm getting it down to like the millimeter or fraction of an inch or whatever unit of measurement you use. Like getting it that precise actually really makes a difference in your imaging. And you're going to be relying less on software to time align things when you do that.
right.
So, anyways, because I've done that process, I know that, when I put this here to my rear speaker, that's the furthest speaker away from me.
Right.
So because of that, that's the first one I'm going to measure in the software. So I'm gonna go back into sharing mode here, and I'm going to show you, if you didn't have automatic tools to line up your timing, how you could do it manually with a software like Open Sound Meter. And let's shoot some pink noise at the rear speaker. So there's this button here that says apply estimated delay. So with the pink noise on, I'm going to press that. Okay, so the value it applied was 31.92 milliseconds. That means there's 31.92 millisecond difference between the input signal, which is coming straight out of the Dolby Atmos renderer, versus the signal that's coming out of the speaker. So that's a combination of the time it takes to travel from the speaker to the microphone, its latency out of the Dolby Atmos render, its latency through my interface, its latency through the loopback software I'm actually using to get it back into my interface. You could do it with a physical cable, which has no latency, but that's the entire latency of the chain. That value in and of itself doesn't matter as much. What's going to matter is what happens next when I go to another speaker, and we're going to see the time difference of that speaker versus the furthest speaker away. So let's do the left speaker. Let's be working with that one. We're gonna send pink noise out the left. Okay, I'll turn the ping noise off, but you can see here, when I hover my mouse over, there's an estimated delay delta. Delta is the Greek word for change, the difference of the two. So when I have the pink noise running, it's showing the difference of my speaker that's furthest away versus the channel I'm currently measuring. So let's do that one more time. And let's note the number. Okay, it was reading minus 4.94 milliseconds. So let's go ahead and let's put 4.94 milliseconds into DADMAN for my delay on the left speaker. And now let's see what our delta delay is. It should be 0 now that I've done
that. So cool.
Bingo. So that's how you do it manually. So what I would do is I would first do that with every single speaker and get them to be in time with each other. Then I would bring the subwoofer into play and see what the relationship is with one of the timed up speakers to the subwoofer, and then apply some additional delay to either the speaker or the subwoofer to get them to line up. Now, in my situation, I had to make a delay on the speaker to get it to line up with the subwoofer. So I would do that with one channel. I would note like how much additional delay I need to add to that channel to get it to line up. And then I would apply that additional delay onto every single one of the speakers. So you're going to start with a situation where you've already got a bit of delay on the speaker. Make note of how much more delay you add. Let's say it's 3 milliseconds, and add that 3 milliseconds on every single speaker. Again, we're talking about almost 5 milliseconds to get it to line up with the rear speaker, and then another 4 milliseconds to get it to line up
with the
subwoofer, right? So, you're adding quite a bit of delay. If you've got other tools to get it to line up, they might be useful. So even talking about this, I might even want to check my calibration again and see if I can get away with adding a little bit less delay so I have less latency from when I hit play to when the sound comes out of the speakers. It's all a bit of a dance, is all I'm going to say. These are the principles you have to get onto the dance floor without tripping over your feet.
That's a great analogy.
Anyways, that's that in a nutshell. I said I was going to do this quickly, but it's not a quick topic. It's
right.
It's fairly involved, but it was really enlightening for me the first time that I saw that phase trace move and lock in with its companion phase trace on the subwoofer, and how you could see the frequency response of the system completely alter when that was happening in real time. It made me want to redo every mix I'd done in the first half of my career.
Right.
So knowledge is power. Now you know that tool, Open Sound Meter, is a free tool to use. You can donate to the maker of the software if you're using it all the time. And I know now that I know that it's out there, I probably will be doing the same. So, So kudos to whoever put that together. I don't know him personally. This isn't an advertisement. I just think it's really useful.
Yeah. And if you're like me and do live sound, I from here on out will be using that software to align my speakers in live sound as well. But very underrated tool that has been used for live sound for a while that is super streamlined for studio calibration. Like I was so obsessed with Room EQ Wizard and all the tools that are great for it, but it has so much to offer that you kind of question yourself on what's really important in a calibrated studio.
Room EQ Wizard is a great tool also, but it's a different tool for a different purpose. I mean, this one I find really useful because you just get that real-time feedback while you're doing things. And it gives you just so much confidence because you can just see, well, if I move my speaker an inch, look at the change there. If I move my subwoofer an inch, look at the change. So it's really it's so useful.
Well, I think we got everything pretty much covered about what we wanted to talk about. Is there any final remarks you'd like to let the audience know that might be that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I one last underrated thing about all this is workflow. I think is a big one, and not workflow of like how you measurement, but like how your choice of calibrating the room and setting up your speakers feeds back into your creative workflow. So for me, I'm using a Dadman system for my crossovers. I'm using GLM for my EQ. That means anything that plays back off of my system, whether it's off of my Mac onboard audio, whether it's out of Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton, Dolby Atmos render, it doesn't matter. Apple Music, it's going through that curve, and I know that I'm hearing things accurately if it makes it to one of these speakers. There's other tools out there that are more software based as opposed to hardware based, which is what I was talking about. Even though it's controlled by software, those filters that you saw, they're actually embedded in the hardware. So when I was adjusting Dadman, that's a filter that lives in my interface. When I was adjusting DLM, that's a filter that lives in my speakers. There's other
Right.
software based solutions which are great, which can get you there quickly for a fraction of the price, but it can get in the way of workflow a bit if you're just using a plugin. Now, thankfully, like people like Sound ID or SonarWorks or whatever we're calling them now. Not sure. I think Sound ID is the software, but SonarWorks is the company, right? I
Yeah.
think that's right. Could be wrong. Anyways, so I think Sound ID is really making the right moves now that they're partnering with interface makers like the UA Apollo, like the DAD interfaces, Matrix Studio, Audient Araya, because I think they've realized that the plugin only gets you so far. Um, and it's a very useful plugin. I used it for many years, but I was always run into those pitfalls that other people run into where, when you switch to a different set of speakers or switch to headphones, you got to remember to switch that curve on SonarWorks. Oh, and then if you
Hmm.
play music off your Mac, you got to remember that you've got your system audio running and which curve is that one on? And you're doing all this thinking and it's kind of wasting bandwidth on what's important, which is making creative decisions in a mix. So I can't stress enough how great for workflow it's been that all these filters are actually just embedded in the hardware itself. And so whatever sound comes out of these speakers is accurate sound. I don't got to think about what buttons to press before it's accurate. It's just once I do this work, the work's done, and now I can just be creative.
Right. I agree. And I've actually not I don't want to say discouraged because I understand people don't have the budget for some of these monitors, even though like the Audient Araya is actually pretty affordable, especially for an Atmos interface.
Yeah, relatively speaking, for sure.
I couldn't understand why anyone wanted to use the built-in calibration setup in the external Dolby Atmos renderer. Like my first thought was when I'm listening to music, whether it's stereo or immersive, how easy is it going to be to configure in the Atmos renderer if I'm cal using it to calibrate? I'm like, I just want to plug and play. And I do like the idea of some of the software solutions, like I think Ginger Audio has, where
Mm-hmm.
you can send all of your audio, no matter the format. Like if you're sending a 714 signal from Apple Music, and I think there are some software solutions that allow you to kind of like how Dadman allows you to select your different sources and go straight out to your output. So there might be some good software solutions, but in the end, hardware is king. I 100% agree. In
For
terms of
sure.
creative workflow, it's gonna be the easiest. And in terms of long-term investment, if you're really serious about making music and getting accurate translation between what your intent is with other people's music, if you're a mix engineer, it's super crucial.
Absolutely. And actually, I used that Ginger Audio product before, and it works really, really well. it's super useful, and it can do a lot of the things that I do inside of my data interface. The the data interface just does it with zero latency. That's the big difference.
Yeah.
So when I want to go, plug in a guitar and play, I'm not getting all that added delay going through a virtual audio device like you are with the Ginger Audio Sphere, which again, if you're just mixing, it's something you might want to look at. It's a pretty useful device, a pretty useful piece of software rather.
So with everything that we have and with all this being said, I think it's also a matter of understanding where we're coming from with studio calibration and what all compromise you can have with your studio. Like you don't necessarily have to spend uh, a dollar and a dime on an audio interface, nor do you have to have like a huge room. What really matters is, are your speakers phase aligned? Are your subs phase aligned? And how well is your response in the room? And I would argue that something we really didn't touch on this, which I think we did at the beginning of the video, is acoustics, which is a whole different topic in itself. Uh, when you get those right from the get-go, even with just a set of iLoud speakers, understanding these concepts is going to significantly improve your room, your mix workflow, and your creative decision making.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, the more you can do with physics and without the aid of software and hardware tools, the better your results are going to be. Because less, it's just like with mixing. Uh, I find less is usually more when you're doing a mix. If you find yourself really cranking that compressor and really cranking that EQ, maybe it's, stop and think, is this the right thing to be doing? Or is there something else I could be doing that's simpler to get it there? It might be the case that it's not, but having that mentality, I find, has made for better results.
Yeah. Crank the knob all the way and then dial it back some
Dial it
until it
back.
sounds right. Yeah. Always dial it
Exactly.
back. Well,
Yeah.
Alex, I appreciate you for taking the time to hop on this call and discuss a bunch of nerdy stuff that I feel
Yeah, you
like
got it, man.
that you feel like and I feel like, and I'm sure whoever else is watching this video is gonna be thinking that's very important.
Yeah, it's a really important topic. I think it's under discussed, and I hope people get some value out of this and learn some things about how they can optimize their setup. And thank
Awesome.
you, and thank you also very much for having me on this. It was really a pleasure to talk about this, and I love all the content you're putting out. Again, some of those videos you put out before we met have been really helpful for me getting my setup rigged up. So I hope that this one can add to that hopefulness of your catalog of videos. So thanks for allowing me to contribute to that.
I appreciate that the most. Thank you, Alex.
Hey, thank you, Alex.